Suddenly the room goes quiet. It must be a time to start. So my name is Frank Clooney. I'm a professor here in the Div School and director of the Center for the Study of World Religions. I'd like to welcome you and thank you all for coming to this very exciting event that we are having here tonight. A little background to begin with. One of the services that the center provides to the Divinity School, the study of religion, and the university is the discussion of new faculty books when they come out. And we are a productive faculty, and books are always coming out. But it's one of the most interesting parts, I think, of our time together is to be able to talk to one another about one's research. We know that faculty publish books. We often do not have a chance to hear why they published the book that they did, how they came about to write the book, what motivated them, what were the burning issues, the scholarly issues that drove them to write. And the occasion like this is to, first of all, give the author a chance to say briefly why he or she came to do the writing. And then, by nature, of course, of these productions of the books, we have a great variety of subject matter coming up in the various books. So, for instance, we had a book event a few weeks ago, Rachel McCleary from the Kennedy School of Government on the economics of religion, a very different kind of discussion. We have 2 book discussions planned for the spring thus far. Dan McCannon of our faculty, Prophetic Encounters, Religion and the American Radical Tradition, and David Hempton, our historian, The Church in the Long 18th Century. So I think just by taking up these projects of hearing about the books and discussing them, we share the wealth, we learn about ourselves as colleagues and part of the Harvard and Divinity School community, and we learn a lot about these different topics. I think this is particularly true tonight. When we take up Leila Ahmed's book, A Quiet Revolution, The Veil's Resurgence from the Middle East to America, the interest that people show in this book has been manifest in the fact that it's not only sponsored by the Center for the Study of World Religions in the Divinity School, but also by our Women's Studies in Religion program, and also by the Prince Alawid bin Talal Islamic Studies program. And I welcome anyone who's come from elsewhere in the university for our event tonight. Leila Ahmed came to the Divinity School in 1999 as the first professor of women's studies and religion and was appointed to the Victor S. Thomas Chair in 2003. Her many writings include several books, Women and Gender in Islam, The Historical Roots of a Modern Debate, Edward William Lane, A Study of His Life and Work and of British Ideas of the Middle East in the 19th Century. Her most well-known book, I believe, is the 2000 book, A Border Passage from Cairo to America, A Woman's Journey, that has been widely acclaimed and used in classes all over the world. And of course, today we have today's book, The Veil's Resurgence from the Middle East to America. Leila Ahmed is in the envious position that though the book has just come out, it's been reviewed widely already in the press. I was doing a little surfing to find out what people were saying about the book, and I'll just give you several examples. Leila Lalami in the LA Times, A Quiet Revolution is an important book. It provides a thorough history of the resurgence of the veil both in the Muslim world and the United States. It adds significant nuance to the complex issues that surround the veil. Ahmed's work will no doubt continue to inspire a new generation of Muslim feminists. Rachel Aspden in The Guardian Observer in the UK, a timely reminder that the veil today is a symptom less of an alien fanaticism than of a long political and cultural entanglement with the unveiled West. And finally, Christine Stansell in The New Republic. In delicate passages, Ahmed ventures her own longings for a larger space for women within the faith, for free-spirited inquiry, discussion, and a return to the rational interpretation and scrutiny of holy text. Ahmed finds a distinctly American Islam where women are playing an unprecedented role and gender inequality is often discussed. It is, as she declares, a new moment in history, in the history of Islam, as well as the history of America. A celebrated book that we'll look forward to discussing tonight. So the format of our discussion will be, we'll give the first words to Leila Ahmed herself, again under this rubric of how did you come to write this book? Why did you write this book? What went into this book, briefly, to hear a little of that. Then we'll have 3 respondents who I'll introduce after Leila has spoken. Then we'll have a bit of open time for discussion, and around 7:30 or so we'll break up and proceed across the street to the center for a reception. But let us begin our session by welcoming Leila Ahmed to tell us about her book.
Thank you. So, is this right? Can you hear me? Yes? No? Okay. Thank you so much, Frank, for inviting me, and thank you for your very gracious and kind welcome, and thank you all for being here, and from the panelists. I'm actually very grateful for Frank telling me what it is I should talk about, because I have no idea how on earth to talk intelligibly about a book in 10 or 15 minutes, which is my allotted time, and so I'm going to do exactly what Frank suggested, which is explain why on earth I wrote this book. So I just have a few comments about that. So its starting point for me was quite simply when I began noticing, and this was back in the 1990s, that the hijab or Islamic headscarf seemed to be steadily becoming more and more common here in America. It was far less common then than it is today, and in part because of the political events of this last decade, and in particular 9/11, have had the paradoxical effect of actually spurring many Muslim women to take on wearing hijab. In any case, in the late 1990s, hijab wearing seemed to be distinctly on the rise here. And for me, just this fact was arresting and intriguing enough, and even frankly, slightly alarming to make me want to set forth on this study. Now, why, you might well ask, would the hijab trend have been intriguing and even slightly alarming to me? Why did simply the presence of the hijab signal to me that there was something here that really merited investigation? Back in the 1990s, a number of colleagues who, like me, were of Middle Eastern background, were also concerned about the hijab trend. In contrast, my American non-Middle Eastern colleagues were typically quite unconcerned about it. To them, the reason that Muslim women were wearing hijab seemed quite straightforward. They were obviously wearing it because they were observant Muslims and Islam required hijab. Similarly, to them, the reason that there was a growing trend right now of women wearing hijab was also simple enough. Muslim immigration had begun to rise very fast after the 1960s, 65, and now we had a new generation of Muslims coming of age who were the children of this new wave of immigrants, and naturally, therefore, we were seeing more Muslim women. They were becoming more visible to us, and they were wearing hijab, and that's just how it was. That's why there was a trend. This trend, in other words, was merely a reflection of a demographic shift and the growing presence of Muslims in the fabric of American society. Now, these sorts of explanations, on one level, were actually quite valid, but they also completely bypassed and failed to address the concerns that the mere presence of the hijab trend, for me, had raised questions. Simply on the visual level, the trend very directly and viscerally evoked for me the dramatic and changeful history of the hijab that I personally had lived through over the course of the last half century. And I knew too, beyond what I personally experienced myself, that over the course of the whole 20th century as a whole, the story of the veil and whether Muslim women did or did not wear it, should or should not wear it, had been a story of huge shifts and dramatic reversals. The 20th century had begun, in fact, with Muslim women eagerly throwing off their hijabs, and a movement that, beginning in Istanbul, Turkey, and in Cairo, Egypt, gradually became a tidal wave of unveiling that swept across much of the Arab Middle East and gradually the rest of the Muslim urban world. Along with this unveiling wave had come growing demands for education, for rights for women, and among them rights to professional employment, and for equal pay, for broad reforms in women's legal status. By the time I grew up in Cairo in the 1940s and 50s, the veil or headscarf had become almost a thing of the past. Even my mother had grown up in a society in which wearing hijab had ceased to be a norm for Muslim women. Deeply devout, observant Muslim women, as well as less pious and even altogether non-pious Muslim women, no longer wore hijab. It was simply no longer the dress, simply no longer considered a religious requirement. The common understanding of this period was that hijab had been a cultural accretion in Islam rather than a fundamental religious requirement. In going about their lives without veils, therefore, the rationale was Muslim women were simply leaving aside an inessential cultural custom, and they were dressing in the modern, albeit conservative styles that were felt now to be appropriate to modern, forward-looking Muslim women. Thus, not wearing a veil by no means implied that women had put aside Islam. Religious faith through the 1950s and 60s was very much, as I recall it, an ordinary and prevalent part of daily life in Cairo. So such then were the norms and assumptions for a significant proportion of people who came of age in majority Muslim cities any time up to about 1980. Normal dress now was to be unveiled. This was the norm in the majority of cities, but not in all of them. In the Arabian Peninsula, for example, unveiling had progressed far more slowly, and in one part of the peninsula, specifically Saudi Arabia, it had been forbidden. Unveiling had been forbidden by law. Similarly, while being unveiled had become the mainstream norm in many Muslim majority cities by the 1950s, there were, in fact, minority groups within those cities who opposed the non-veiling trend and who considered the veil, in fact, to be a fundamental Islamic requirement. This was the case in Egypt, for example, with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization that had been founded in 1928. In the 1940s and 50s, Saudi Arabia, the one country at that point firmly committed to veiling, was only just beginning to exploit its oil fields. It had not as yet emerged as the major global economic power that it would become by the 1970s. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which had been a force to be reckoned with in the 1930s, would be crushed and almost decimated through the 50s and 60s by the Nasser regime. All of this would quickly change during the 1970s, after Sadat succeeded Nasser as president of Egypt. This was the Cold War era. Sadat decided to turn his back on the Nasserite policies of socialism and of alliance with the Soviet Union in favor of a rapprochement with the United States. To counter criticism on the left, Sadat encouraged the religious right, giving support to various Islamic groups, among them the Muslim Brotherhood, and helping them take over control of powerful organizations on university campuses previously controlled by the left. By this point, too, the early 70s, Saudi Arabia had emerged as a world economic power, and it too now pursued policies of supporting Islamic movements across the Middle East and indeed across the world. It was at this point, in the mid-1970s, that for the first time in many decades, a handful of women on university campuses in Cairo and Alexandria began to appear in hijab. They wore not the old traditional style hijabs that, say, their grandmothers might have worn, but they wore rather distinctively new and modern-looking hijabs. People in mainstream society observing this development were baffled, and some were appalled by it. We have reports, for instance, of university professors at Cairo in the 1970s forbidding women in hijab to even enter their classrooms. Many mainstream Egyptians considered the appearance of this new hijab as a sign that Saudi Arabia was now using its wealth to spread Saudi-style Wahhabi Islam in Egypt. Others saw the hijab trend as a sign of the growing power in society of Islamic groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, groups which many thought were militantly fundamentalist, in contrast, as people believed, to the quietist, non-political Islam of the mainstream majority. Nobody at that point, no scholar that I know of, predicted that this veiling trend, made up initially of a minuscule number of people, could possibly come one day to spread to mainstream society, and even, in fact, soon enough, completely transform that society into an overwhelming majority veiled women. In the 1950s, the late Albert Hourani, the Oxford historian and author of the best-selling History of the Arabs, had published an article called The Vanishing Veil, in which he predicted that the veil would soon be a thing of the past in the Arab Middle East. People in mainstream society in Egypt continued to believe this right to the end of the 1970s. Of course, as we now know, the veil did not vanish, but on the contrary made a dramatic comeback. By the early 1980s, the hijab trend had already made a tremendous inroads in mainstream Egyptian society, and indeed it was already spreading fast across the world. For those of us who witnessed these transformations, the return or rebirth of the hijab was inextricably bound up with the rise of Saudi Arabia as economic power, as well as with the spread, along with this, of the form of Islam espoused by the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic groups. Inevitably, therefore, seeing the emergence of the hijab trend in America very forcefully brought to mind for me all of this history of internal political divisions within Islam, divisions symbolized by confrontation and reversal around precisely this issue of the hijab. So now I find myself asking, in relation to the hijab trend in America, whether this trend too was connected to the transformations in dress and also in styles of religious practice that had so recently transformed the societies of the Middle East. Did the hijab's presence now here in America mean that the form of Islam that was gaining ground here too was shaped by Wahhabi views of Saudi Arabia and the conservative perspectives of the Muslim Brotherhood? My questions bore on a number of key concerns. One, for example, was in relation to Islamic militancy. In Egypt, the country which was the cradle of the new veiling movement, as it had been the cradle earlier of the unveiling movement, the spread of veiling had been accompanied by rising levels of Islamic violence. Were these phenomena connected, or was their apparent simultaneity simply coincidental? Another question was whether the forces behind the spread of veiling in Egypt had also been behind its spread now in America. And the further question I had was in relation to understanding what kind of Islam it was that was spreading now here along with the veil. All that I knew at the time, either about Wahhabi Islam or the Islam of the groups such as the Muslim Brotherhood, was that they were distinctly conservative, distinctly illiberal as regards women and women's rights. If these indeed were the forms of Islam that were now gaining ground here, did this mean that we were now set here on a course that would lead eventually to confrontation and collision between conservative Islam and American values regarding women's rights? Similarly, I'd associated conservative types of Islam with militancy and anti-Western values. If conservative Islam was taking root here, were we soon going to see then Islamic militancy on these shores? So these broadly were the sorts of questions that the sheer presence of the hijab trend now automatically raised for me, and it was these which I set out to investigate. The nature of my questions defined the parameters of the book. First of all, it was going to be essential to find out what exactly it was that had happened in Egypt beginning in the 1970s. I needed to understand not only what kind of Islam this was, but also how it had persuaded women who had never worn hijab to start wearing it. In these same years of the 70s and 80s, the Islamic Revolution of Iran had imposed the hijab on women in Iran, but they had had to enact a law requiring women to wear it, and had then proceeded to forcibly enforce that law. In the Middle East, however, and eventually in Europe and America, apparently no compulsion had been used. Somehow, they had created in women the will and desire to wear hijab. How had this been accomplished? And why did women in Egypt join the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic movements? What was in it for them? And how then did this movement make its way to America? These were the questions I pursue in part one. In part two, I followed how this movement had come to America. Having followed out how it had come to America, I now focus on studying the ways in which this once illiberal Islamic movement as regards women was now being transformed as it took root in America by the traditions of this country. For obviously the US was a very different sort of society from the Middle Eastern home societies that had exported this form of Islam. So I follow out in part two the developments that had occurred in relation to women's rights and Islam in America, and I focus in these last chapters in particular on the first decade of the 21st century, a decade profoundly marked, of course, by the conditions and events that came about in the aftermath of the tragedy of 9/11. These conditions, I found, had directly impacted the subject of women in Islam and directly also on American Muslim women's activism. So this then is the broad outline of the book, and of course I'm happy to expand on anything in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. So our procedure, as I mentioned, now will have the three distinguished scholars to give their reactions to the book. They were not asked to summarize the book or to respond to every part of it, but to pick out particular themes or points of interest in their own consideration. So I will introduce all three, and then they will come up in this order. The first will be Jane Smith, who is the Associate Dean for Faculty and Academic Affairs and Senior Lecturer in Divinity. And she's been here at the Divinity School this time since 2008, but she was at Harvard a bit earlier, from 1973 to 1986, when she served as Professor of Comparative Religion and at various times as Associate Director of the Center for the Study of World Religions and Associate Dean of the Divinity School. In 1986, Jane left Harvard, went to become Vice President and Dean of Iliff School of Theology in Denver. In more recent years, she was Professor of Islamic Studies at Hartford Seminary and co-director of the Duncan Black McDonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations. She teaches and writes on historical and theological relations between Christians and Muslims, Muslim communities in America, and women in Islam. Among her publications are included several recent books: Islam in America, revised 2009, Educating the Muslims of America, co-edited with Farid Senzai and Ivan Haddad, Muslims, Christians, and the Challenge of Interfaith Dialogue, Muslim Women in America, and Muslim Minorities in the West, Visible and Invisible. Our second discussant will be Susan Abraham, who is Associate Director of the Center and also a professor here in Ministry Studies program. Susan's teaching and research explores post-colonial and feminist theological practices that invigorate contemporary communities of faith. She is the author of Identity, Ethics, and Nonviolence in Post-Colonial Theory, a Rainerian theological assessment that came out in 2007, and the co-editor of the 2009 book, Shoulder to Shoulder, Frontiers in Catholic Feminist Theology. Ongoing research projects include issues in feminist theological education and formation, interfaith and interreligious peace initiatives, theology and political theory, religion and media, global Christianity, and Christianity between colonialism and post-colonialism. And finally, having crossed the river all the way from BU, Kecia Ali, who is Associate Professor of Religion in the Department of Religion at Boston University. She had received her PhD in religion from Duke University, where she was the recipient in 2002 of the James B. Duke Fellowship. Her specialization in her studies was Islamic Studies. 2004 to 2006, she held the Florence Levy Kay Postdoctoral Fellowship in Islamic Studies and Women's Studies at Brandeis University. But she too is no stranger to HDS. In 2003-04, Kecia was a research fellow here in the Divinity School in the Women's Studies and Religion program. So welcome back. And her research interests include Islamic religious texts, especially jurisprudence, women in both classical and contemporary Muslim discourses, and religious biography. She is the author of Sexual Ethics in Islam, Feminist Reflections on Quran, Hadith, and Jurisprudence, Islam, the Key Concepts, Marriage and Slavery in Early Islam in 2010, and just released, hot off the press, Imam Shafi, Scholar and Saint 2011, which appears in One World's Makers of the Muslim World series. Her current research focuses on biographies of the Prophet Muhammad. So our three discussants bring incredible wealth, riches, and learning to the occasion, and they will speak in turn. So let us welcome our discussants.
Good evening and assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure to see all of you. As Leila knows, I like this book very much. If you haven't yet read it, I commend it highly. And here are some of the reasons why I enjoyed reading it. First, Leila is an extraordinarily good and sensitive writer. The book isn't about her, but she lets you view events through her eyes. Right in the beginning, in talking about the perceptions that she and her friends had about the increased wearing of the veil in Egypt, she says, "The hijab had meanings for us that it did not have for most Americans, essentially because of the history we had ourselves directly lived and witnessed. This was history that we knew viscerally in our memory and in the pulse of our being." So she draws you right into this narrative. The two major themes of the book are the phenomenon of the rise of Islamism, particularly in Egypt, and the development of a new multivocal, multi-ethnic, cultural American Islam, especially as expressed by women. Now, a good deal has been written about both of these themes, but Leila's particular contribution is that she draws the connection between these two. She explains that you really cannot have the second without understanding the first. In the first part of the book, she provides a fascinating history of Egyptian political and religious thought from the time of King Farouk through Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak, as she has indicated. She talks about the actions and reactions of the three forces of Western, primarily British, imperialism, pro-Western Egyptian sympathizers, and anti-Western, ultimately Islamist sentiment. Leila returns repeatedly to what she calls Westerners' view of the veil as a sign of the inferiority of Islam. She links the basic presuppositions of classical colonialism to the long-standing assumption of the West that it knows best what Muslim women should be doing and about and look like. And especially, she calls attention to its direct ties, this assumption, to rhetoric supporting the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. As the U.S. launched wars on Afghanistan and Iraq, says Leila, the reemergence of this theme and the extent to which these old, familiar imperial strategies were suddenly now resuscitated and replayed was startling. For me, this was one of the most powerful insights of the book. Leila is very skilled at putting the narrative into a biographical mode. She tells stories. Both in Egypt and America, she uses the lives of real women and also men, some well known and others not, to illustrate the stories that she wants to tell. I remember some years ago, Chrissy Atkinson and Diana Eck and I taught a course entitled Women in Christianity, Hinduism, and Islam. And I think it might have been actually in this very room. And I called attention to some of the figures that I considered really important in Islamic history, particularly from Egypt. And I was delighted to, again, meet many of these characters, such as Zainab al-Ghazali, the head of the women's branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, as I read her book, in which you get the narrative in this very personalized way. In the U.S., among many other examples, she gives serious attention to Leila Bakhtiar's English translation of the Quran as the Sublime Quran. She says that it created a stir, particularly because of its interpretation of Surah 4, verse 34, which has caused, indeed, a great deal of conversation. I hope she's right that it caused a stir. I have to say that as I have asked Muslim women in various parts of the country if they have read this, unfortunately, many of them have not. So we will see if, in fact, this stir really comes. Leila argues with Bakhtiar and many others that a new American-born generation begins to take the reins. This is undoubtedly true, but I found myself not absolutely certain of just how Leila thinks this generation's work will be evidenced. She says that the post-9/11 era in America is one of unprecedented opportunity for Muslim feminists, liberals, and progressives. But she also seems to say that with the dominance of the Islamist influence, it's going to be hard for the voices of liberals and progressives to be heard. And Leila, you can certainly correct me if I have misinterpreted you on this. And for example, she gives the fizzle of the Progressive Muslim Union, the Daughters of Hajar, Muslim Wake Up, and so forth, which she says have proved ephemeral. So again, we'll have to wait to see how this plays out. Altogether, Leila says, the study of the Islamic textual and legal heritage as regards women is livelier and more dynamic today than at any other time. She describes the shift underway in regard to American Muslim women, arguing that not only women associated with organizations like the Islamic Society of North America, headed for some time by Ingrid Mattson, a first to have a woman in that presidency, and the Muslim Student Association, but also liberals and even radicals have been directly touched and influenced by Islamism at some point in their lives. This is a basic argument of the second part of the book. She links the new wave of Islamic activism influenced by the teachings of Islamism, quote, with the ideals and understanding of justice in America in these very specific decades. The distinguishing mark of American Muslim women and gender activists is the fact that they were all touched and influenced by Islamism, which has justice at its core. Leila then sees the Islamist commitment to justice as naturally merging with the American tradition of activism. One can take away a number of very important and even startling conclusions from this book. Two in particular stand out for me, and these are Leila's own conclusions. The first has to do with the relationship of Islamists to American society. Leila says, this then is the conclusion that I find myself arriving at in light of the evidence surveyed through the preceding pages, a conclusion that represents a complete reversal of my initial expectations. That is, it's the Islamists and not secularists who are actively defining American traditions of social and political activism and protest in pursuit of justice. The second conclusion, or really it's a set of two connected conclusions, is even more startling, at least to me. Among the first questions I always get when I'm talking about Islam to public audiences is, and you can guess, why are Muslim women so oppressed? Leila shakes up this common assumption of the American public by wondering if the subject, the oppression of women in Islam, is any longer a useful or even valid topic. She says, the notion of the oppression of Muslim women is a political construct conjured into being to serve particular political ends, as under Cromer's British imperialism. The question now, she asserts, is how we address such issues while not allowing our work and concerns to aid and abet imperialist projects. The second part of this conclusion, I think, is even more basic. Because the subject of Muslim women, she says, is inextricably entangled with the key political and social issues affecting society as a whole, there is really no intelligible overall subject of women in Islam. I think of all the books that have been written and the courses that have been offered under the title Women in Islam, and wonder what's going to happen to those now. Both of these concepts, women in Islam and oppression of the women in Islam, are relics, says Leila, of an imperialist past. With this argument, she again skillfully brings the narrative back around to the point where she started in the mid-1950s in Egypt. I would put forth a few questions either to Leila or to others in the audience to see if we could get the conversation going when our three responses are concluded. The first is that Leila cites Khalid Abul Fadl and his book, The Great Theft, as an example of the denunciation of Wahhabi Islam and identification of the deep schism in contemporary Islam between moderates and Puritans. This rift plays out in a whole range of literature about pluralism in Islam. So my question is, does one come away from Leila's book thinking that the battle has been won by the Islamists? Or, if so, what do they have in common with what Al-Fadl calls extremists or Puritans. She does say that secular or non-Islamist Muslims actually make up the majority of American Muslims. Maybe another way of putting the question is this: is the so-called struggle for the soul of Islam, which we hear often, said to be going on in much of the Islamic world, also characteristic of Islam in America? Another topic for conversation. Growing attention is being given by scholars of Islam and politics in America to the influence of neoconservatives on the fortunes of Islam. There's a very excellent article which I recommend in the July 2011 issue of the Muslim World by Ghada Talhami on the neocons and Arab and Muslim women, in which she argues that there is no avoiding the fact that the women's issue is intimately intertwined with American foreign policy, with a rise of Muslim and non-Muslim neoconservative phenomena, and with the deterioration of Christian-Muslim communal relations. Again, then she goes into a number of details. And Leila, of course, does identify this as an issue in her book, but my question is really, does she give sufficient weight to the influence of the neocons on the development of contemporary American Islam, and especially on women? Third, I'm almost done. Leila says, Islamic feminism in America is more lively today than at any other time in my own lifetime. But exactly what is it? It's not always easy to discern the distinctions in ideology of American Muslim women. We have Islamists, Muslim activists and writers who are deeply committed to Islam but may not identify as Islamists. Secular or non-Islamist Muslim women. We have, as this article referred to, neoconservative Muslim feminists such as Kecia Ali and Irshad Manji. So my question is, are the terms secular, Islamist, and non-Islamist clearly distinguished categories? And if so, how does feminist fit into them? And finally, Leila quotes Salima Abdul Ghafoor, who talks about this as the first true generation of American Muslim women. Pioneers forging a way forward. Pioneers forging a way forward for other Muslims across the world. But a few weeks ago, I heard the same claim made by journalist Robin Wright for many of the countries of the Arab Muslim world. So my question is, are American Muslim women really in a leadership position, or are they simply part of a movement that's happening in many places across the world? Thanks again, Leila, for your most intriguing book. And let's hear from our other respondents.
Thank you, Leila, for this beautiful book. You don't know this, but I absolutely insisted on responding. This is bully pulpit for me. I mean, CSWR organized this, and I said, I'm doing this one. My interests and tastes run to the theoretical, so I'm going to frame my discussion of the book in theoretical terms. But I wanted to begin with a painting, an image that I don't have with me. I'm too soft. It was actually the cover of a New Yorker magazine dated July 30, 2007. In it, artist Anita Kunz, the painting's title is Girls Will Be Girls. And Anita Kunz depicts 3 women sitting next to each other in a subway car. One woman in full hijab, only her eyes showing. The woman next to her in a bikini and flip-flop sandals. And next to her, a Catholic nun, veiled except for her face. The 3 women are clearly in the United States. They're traveling in a subway car. And this is evidenced by a subway map of Lower Manhattan in the background. The idea presented in the painting is that girls will be girls because they can be girls in the liberal multicultural space of the West, as long as they choose to wear whatever they wear. My feminist nerve is suspicious of choice and arguments from choice. For me, the problem points to a more complex issue of the relationship of tradition to modernity. Chronicling such events, particularly these relationships, can never be smooth or simple. They're not even narratives, because women are positioned differently in a contest between modernity and tradition. Thus, in comparative view, I would like to explore the conundrum that the book presents, Leila's book presents, through a brief foray into the dress of Roman Catholic nun women. In an equally interesting historical exploration of the sartorial habits of Roman Catholic nuns in the United States, Elizabeth Kunz, in a book titled The Habit, so the garb of the nuns is called The Habit, A History of the Clothing of Catholic Nuns, argues that the distinctive black and white garb of these nuns serves as a universal representation of holiness. The habit, the dress, reflects traditional theological ideas. Some religious orders' habits are nothing less than highly symbolic. For example, the habit of the sister adorers of the precious blood had 7 buttons on the cape, which refer to the putative last 7 sayings of Jesus on the cross, including, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, or woman, behold your son, and so forth. The cords that the sisters wore are reminiscent of the cords that were used to scourge Jesus. The veil that the nuns wore symbolized contempt for the world, and the wimple and the coronet which they wore on their heads symbolize the crown of thorns. Not only the clothing itself, but the habit in daily life was meant to inculcate a deep sense of reflectivity about living. And none had to, quote, keep custody of the eyes, unquote, which meant that the sisters normally directed their eyes downward. It was illicit to look men directly in the eye for any reason, or to gaze at worldly things for too long as gazing in shop windows. Walking was to be accomplished in a calm and demure manner. The habit, the long flowing cloths of the habit, assisted in creating the soft, sweeping movements that were desired for women. This clothing was appropriated through a particular reading of the tradition. One important verse to be found in the Jewish Bible, the last chapter of the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, reads, "She has put on strong things. Her fingers have taken hold of the spindle. She has opened her hand to the needy and stretched out her hands to the poor. She shall not fear for her house in the cold of the snow, and has made for herself clothing of tapestry, fine linen, and purple is her covering." This text reflects the ideal of the Jewish wife, and this tradition then carries on in religious orders of women who sought to attach themselves to the institutional church in a particular way. In other words, this dress, particularly this particular kind of dress of religious commitment, had a highly symbolic and imaginative purpose that was an example of embodied commitment to the institution. However, it was an ambivalent habit. So on the one hand, the habit is blamed for suppressing the individuality of the wearer. But on the other hand, it's lauded for erasing class distinctions. But something very interesting happened to these nuns in modernity. When the church modernized, particularly with Vatican II, the ambivalence that the habit had always generated led to a thorough rejection of traditional clothing. This was accomplished by the institutional church demanding that some aspects of church ministry democratize. In particular, those forms of ministry that were traditionally in the hands of women suddenly became viable as forms of ministry to democratize. Tradition here seemed to be in opposition to modernity, and the nuns were encouraged to modernize. In Italian, this word aggiornamento, this modernization, apparently led to an opening up of the institution, and the nuns were told that they could now wear ordinary dress, or the technical word, lay dress like everyone else. But here's the point. Aggiornamento happened disproportionately to nun women. The men did not have to democratize their dress or their ministry. In fact, they now completely identified with traditional sacramental ministry as the purview solely of men. So the democratization of the institutional Roman Catholic Church came at the expense of the work and integrity of women. Uncloaking Catholic women in the name of modernity consequently led to a truncating of possibilities of religious expression for women. So the question to ask here is modernity a good thing for women who want to be religious? In the case of nun women, all of a sudden, their power, their lines of recognition, their visibility in the institution disappeared, and the men's did not. In fact, so much so did this traditional idea of nun women become not just irrelevant, but it became the object of derision and fun. It led to matters of great, I've written over here, nonsense, so you know what I'm talking about. It led to stupid films like Sister Act. It led to Halloween clothing, and I brought show and tell with me, hang on. It led to puppets. So, this clash between modernity and tradition with women in the middle is played out in every part of the world. Nivedita Menon, in an essay titled From the Burqa to the Beauty Parlor, burqa is another word for hijab, points to acts of militant groups in Kashmir who are enforcing the wearing of the veil. The Lashkar-e-Jabbar, in September 2001, announced that all Muslim women in the Valley of Kashmir would have to wear the burqa, and those who did not would be punished. Women were threatened, and in one case, 3 were killed for not wearing the burqa. Here, tradition is imposed through coercion and violence. But there is also a wrinkle. Ambivalence happens here too. The Lashkar-e-Jabbar is not speaking about women wearing the burqa all of the time. In particular forms of spectacle making, women must wear the burqa. In others, it is less important to do so. A Muslim leader who herself chooses only to wear the headscarf while eschewing the burqa says it this way, quote, "When women are encouraged to come out and demonstrate in acts of civil disobedience, their headgear is always missing. Sometimes their clothes are torn. There is no parda at all. Then nobody has a problem. But when one of these women is on her way to the school or to the office, she has acid thrown on her face in the name of vulgarity. This is nothing but hypocritical." This was an interview in the Indian Express, September 7th, 2001. Tradition and modernity. There are other religious and cultural parallels. That is, Islam or Roman Catholicism are not the only ones wanting to dress women or to negotiate the problematic relationship between tradition and modernity. Among Hindutva groups, for example, in India, globalization and Western-style consumerism has led to expressions of deep concern of the threats to Indian culture. Organizations such as the Hindu Right, the Bajrang Dal, or the Akhil Bharatiya Vidyarthi Parishad, all of these with close links to the BJP, have been trying for decades now to enforce dress code for women in universities and other professional situations, claiming that sexual harassment would decrease if women dressed respectably and according to the Indian tradition. The Lashkar-e-Jabbar in this account actually appealed to unveiled Hindu and Sikh women to wear the bindi, the dot on the forehead, to identify themselves as Hindu to spare themselves from attack on these women. Now that puts Christian women in a strange place. For Christian women, the wearing of the bindi is a cosmetic choice. But in this case, Christian women would immediately be identified as too modern. In sum, then, the theoretical issue for feminists is how to relate tradition to modernity. If set up as a binary, tradition and modernity, non-women in veils and Muslim women in veils seem to be hopelessly non-modern and completely traditional. But the insight that Professor Ahmed provides us with is that tradition and modernity ought not to be posed as a binary. Instead, what we can glean is that what is called tradition in post-colonial societies is located in modernity. Both modernity and tradition, as her work shows, are problematic sites for women today. In Ahmed's book, this issue becomes clear in the manner that Muslim women around the world are interpreting what it means to be emancipated. Emancipation from modernity requires veiling, and emancipation from tradition requires unveiling. Personal choice is an invidious category in this case to understand this negotiation. In that case, then, the New Yorker cover painting ought to have been called "Girls Have to Be Girls." In fact, the whole project of cloaking, uncloaking, veiling, and unveiling girls or women brings us back to really the problem for feminism. How do we know that a woman is a woman? That is, will tradition provide an answer, or will modernity? Professor Ahmed's book leaves us with a perplexing answer. Neither. Pow.
I liked this book and had so many things that I wanted to say about it. I actually ran out of Post-its and had to start tearing up a bus schedule to use to mark some of my places. I want to talk briefly about three things that this book does, and I think does exceedingly well, and does exceedingly well in a way that opens up further areas for conversation and research. The first thing it does is that it situates American Islam in a transnational, global historical context, which is to say, as the best research on American Islam has started to do, America is no longer exceptional. It is a site for research, but it is no longer a supposedly bounded entity where Muslims grow up and live and make choices about veiling or about any sort of other things in isolation from the world community. It's never been that way, or at least it hasn't been that way since the middle decades of the 20th century, when we begin to look at this. Leila's own survey of what she did, beginning with the veil, taking you back through the Arabian Peninsula, through Egypt in the 1970s, a little detour in Iran, coming back to the US. We see that intellectually, or ideologically, if we'd like to load that a little bit, or organizationally, or perhaps financially, we follow the oil money, there are significant transnational linkages, and unless we look at them, the phenomenon of veiling in the US simply doesn't really make sense. The one thing I would have liked to see, and it doesn't belong in this book, but one of you who is a scholar of American religion will need to write the companion volume, is to sort out now the story of what's happening with other religious communities in America, which are undergoing also similar sorts of transformations, perhaps not so much tied to other transnational religious communities. Muslims are, in fact, a little bit different in this way, although Hindu diaspora communities would also be a good place to look at this. For Christians, though, there are things about what's happening inside religious congregations, what's happening in terms of evangelical feminism, what's happening in terms of Jewish women's authority. So I think seeing how this wonderful transnational picture can be complemented by the story of what's happening on the American religious stage seemed to me a next step. The second thing that this book does in a very, very interesting way is to talk about women's agency, right? Talking about women's agency through concrete examples of women's involvement in organizational life, in community life, in MSAs, in ISNA. There are wonderful examples of women who rise to positions of elected authority within those organizations. And this is part and parcel of the story of Islamism's social engagement. This is a very important part of the story. There's another story, too, about a slightly different kind of agency, and that's about meaning-making. And the meaning-making that goes into thinking about the hijab. The book has wonderful stories about women who put on the hijab for sometimes diametrically opposed reasons. Right? I do it because my religion tells me to. I do it because I have free choice and I want to demonstrate something else. And then women who take off the hijab for, again, diametrically opposed reasons. And so there are processes of meaning-making here that are, I think, in some sense, bound up with American discussions about choice and about individual liberty. There are also, though, as Leila shows, patterns. Women's justifications for putting on the hijab in the 70s in Iran, in the 90s in Egypt, are echoed by American Muslim women. And so an interesting project would be to think about the ways in which the patterns of talking about veiling and unveiling are shaped by, say, the specific types of pamphlets that get handed out at conferences, by first-person conversion accounts, how I started wearing the hijab, the websites that now talk about these sorts of things, magazines like Aziza, which have different hijab styles on the cover. It seems to me that there is a very rich body of literature to which to connect this bigger story about women's activism to the micro-level story of how do these stories get told, how do they get shaped. And then I think the third thing that this project does, and here is where I'm going to spend a few more minutes talking, is it really engages the question of what does it mean to be Muslim in post-9/11 America. And this is a crucial question for a number of reasons. There is, of course, the big question about what does it mean to be Muslim in the world today, and that is a conversation that's taking place on a global stage, on the global internet, and in pamphlets and books that are being passed around back and forth. But it's also very much a question about what does it mean to be American after 9/11. And to what extent are Muslim communities in America specifically responding to the very local pressures of an American context in this way? And there's a story that she tells on page 203. And to me, it really sums up actually all of what is best about this work. It doesn't sum up the work as a whole because, as all of the speakers have shown, there's a tremendous amount of richness here, a tremendous amount of material, and it's not a story that can be summarized in a page. But what's most exciting about the work and about the narrative strengths and the organizational and analytical strengths that Leila brings to this project shows up here. This is an account of an open house that took place at a mosque, I assume here in Cambridge, Prospect Street? Yeah. And it's a mosque that is not known for being egalitarian. Women pray in a room in the basement and not in the main sanctuary. It is overwhelmingly, I would say, a mosque attended by people born outside of the United States. Many are students, although some are professionals. And let me just simply be very frank and say I haven't typically found it a very welcoming space. Now, not actively hostile, but not particularly welcoming. And yet this story is about an open house held in this space a number of years ago, in which it was open to members of the community at large, in which an American Muslim woman spoke in the main sanctuary, a space typically closed to women, to an audience of mixed Muslims and non-Muslims. And at a particular point in the proceedings, a woman who identified herself as Jewish and an atheist, and those of you in religious studies don't think that's so much of a contradiction, and a feminist, spoke up in this space. And she, first of all, delivered a blistering critique of patriarchal monotheism, right? And she had a few choice things to say in general about religion. But she also expressed her solidarity with the American Muslim community after September 11th and talked about the need for acceptance and the need for welcome and the need for religious freedom in this space. So, first of all, part of what I want here is I want the follow-up. What sorts of things happen again once the outsiders have left the mosque, right? And what sorts of changes does this openness to an outside community effect on the community dynamics? Does it mean that women are being elected to the advisory board now? It may, I don't know. Does it mean that the changes that happen when you have this sort of event filter back in to the community conversations? But the reason I want to highlight this event is because in taking this particular narrative of something that happened in one particular moment, a scholar of tremendous range and capacity has managed to encapsulate all of these really exciting, really problematic, and really, really wonderful dynamics. Nothing is yet settled. There are conclusions here, but it's not the end of the story, and things remain very much in flux. The last thing I want to note, because some of the things that you said made me think about this, is that last weekend I happened to be also at an interfaith event. It was a session of Muslim and Jewish scholars in New York City. And among the day's participants were some Orthodox rabbis and participants in other Jewish communities, political figures, organized Judaism. And one of the speakers on a panel about Islam's foundational texts was Imam Muhammad Magid, who is the current head of ISNA. Ingrid Mattson served her term, and Imam Magid, who is also the leader of the Dulles area Muslim organization, is now the current president of ISNA. And in the course of what was a lively and quite interesting panel on Muslim and Jewish foundational texts, he, without any prompting and without any questioning from the audience, brought up the issue of interpretations of scriptural texts, domestic violence as a problem in Muslim communities, and Quran 434. And what he said was not that people should go read Lali Bakhtiar, but that one should use the Prophet's Sunnah in order to interpret it in a particular way. That is interesting that he did that, interesting that's the way he went. What was more interesting to me and more striking was that he also said you have to go to the very first verse of that chapter in the Quran, the account of creation, which gives an egalitarian message. That the president of ISNA, a male Egyptian president of ISNA in 2011, can be saying an egalitarian reading of the first verse, the chapter of women from the Quran, could be taken as utterly non-controversial, is an indication of how far we've come. When Amina Wadud published Quran and Woman in 1992, and she had some precursors, including Rifat Hassan, who'd published also on this particular question, and some follow-up scholars, Asma Barlas has done work on this, they were perceived as really quite controversial and perhaps saying something that wasn't on its face obvious. But the transformation that has taken place and the extent to which what would have once been feminist interpretations on the margins of accepted Muslim discourse have become the uncontroversial, commonsensical reading of the Quran, and the extent to which Muslim organizations in the US have taken that as something of the party line, at least in some cases, seems to me to indicate that the phenomenon you're talking about here has been tremendously important. And I hope for the follow-up in 10 years to see where we are. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I would like to thank, first of all, our discussants for a wonderful, rich set of reflections on the book. Before we open it for general discussion, I'd like to offer to Leila an opportunity. Would you like to make any comment on the comments?
I don't think so. They were wonderful. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Very rich, as you said.
Okay. So our arrangement now is, as I mentioned, we'll have 15, 20 minutes here and then proceed to an informal reception across the street where you can also ask further questions and further discussion. I think I'll just play the role of the recognizer of the questions, and then when I call on you, you can just pose it to the panel or any particular person, Leila or one of the discussants. And I'd ask you to be somewhat brief in your questions, succinct, so we can get in as many as possible. So I will just look around for hands to raise and call upon. Oh, yes, sorry.
Well, I can't say that I followed the latest, and you're talking about 2009, but I'm not sure. We're talking about 4% who are not veiled. Is that what you said? 6%. But in what way does it break down across class? I mean, I don't know. It seems to me too small a group to be able to conclude anything very much. Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I can really comment. I don't know about it. Thank you.
Don't be shy. Yes.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll just take up the issue of Islamists, which I use actually very reluctantly in the book because I don't know what else to use. And it's a term by which I mean actually the kind of Islam that began in the 1970s, which was very activist, very socially committed, and also brought with it the hijab. So it's in Arabic, it's referred to as as-Sahwa al-Islamiyya, the Islamic revival. Sometimes it's referred to in English as the Islamic revival. Often it's called the rise of fundamentalism, but I think we're past using the term fundamentalist. But it's just an inadequate term, recognizing nevertheless, at least from my perspective, that there was a transformation in the ordinary practice of Islam, which occurred at the Islamic revival, in the 70s that is, and has become a worldwide phenomenon. I don't think many people identify as Islamists, and I actually don't mean it. So it's quite complicated, but I do try in the course of the book to say, for instance, when I talk about Islamism in America, they're not really Islamists, but they're the descendants of people who started the revival. That's essentially, and who took on the kind of practices, including wearing hijab, would take that as a norm now, and it's something that began in the 70s. And feminist, I think everybody, other people would be happy to comment. You're quite right, it's no longer a term that people of this generation, the new generation, I use, I mean.
Can I say something
And please use the microphone. Yeah.
Just a note about this place. I was a student at the Center for the Study of World Religions, it seems eons ago. It was in the 1960s and early 70s, and I can recall Muslim friends who were living and conversing with me on this issue, saying feminism would destroy Islam. I could never identify as a feminist, even though you could see the beginnings of some of the ideas that she was being exposed to sprouting in her mind. And that moved across the decades until now. What I find from a number of Muslim women is, yes, I will identify as a feminist, but I want to determine what kind of feminist, and I will be a Muslim feminist in all of what that entails. So I think there's been a steady movement toward adopting feminism, but with one's own interpretation, and interpretation within the scope of the commentary among Islamic women.
Sure, I can speak.
Oh, sorry. That's heavy.
Oh, I'm sorry. We can take it off.
Did it?
I'll break it in 1 second. So I identify as a Roman Catholic and as a feminist. And as people know, I'm not afraid of using that F word in public. The interesting thing is its reception generally. It creates great discomfort, even for beneficiaries of the feminist project. So to nuance the term, feminism is not simply looking for equality. In fact, that whole rhetoric that feminists are looking for equality fails to look at the framework which determines what equal is. So it's highly unequal and highly skewed anyway, so that's no longer a goal. There is, yes, equality of representation, equality of voice, those are all important goals. But I would nuance the project of feminism by saying we're far more interested in a process of critique. And to define what critique is, I will use a definition by Gayatri Spivak. And critique is, in a way, a tautology here, but it's a persistent act of critique of those structures which we cannot not want to inhabit. So, feminists do not want to go away and live on a planet all by themselves. They would like very much to live on this planet with all of us, making sure that our children will have the kind of opportunities they might have not had. This planet, its democracies, its way of organizing human community is the structure we cannot not want to inhabit. But that doesn't remove, it doesn't take away a fundamental responsibility we have as its inhabitants to critique it. Because the moment we arrive at the project of democracy and we say, we're all set now, we've fixed the problem, it becomes totalitarian. So the project of feminism is not simply saying, oh, out with that, or out with them, whatever that is. It is, how do we continue to live together? So I claim that, and that is a conundrum for most people, a Roman Catholic feminist.
Very briefly, because I do think this is fruitful, but I'm also aware that time is short. I would simply say that I know in some cases Muslim women are sympathetic to the goals of feminism and refuse to adopt the term because pragmatically it doesn't make sense. But I also know that there's a significant strand of principled opposition to use of the term. Asma Barlas, for instance, has a very eloquent explanation of what she considers to be the imperialist implications of the term feminist, and therefore her strong opposition to using it. And Amina Wadud has started to soften a little towards the use of the term, pro-feminist or feminist-friendly, but has identified as a womanist on the basis of the racist implications of the term feminist. So, I think it's a much more complicated question than that. And, if you ask my Boston University female undergraduates about the term feminist, a lot of them will sort of run shrieking in the opposite direction for no good apparent reason that I can see. So,
Yeah. Yes, please. Some of your earlier writings personal, autobiographical, and in this one you sort of go back and forth between the objective and the personal. How did you decide to do that?
Oh, well, I don't think I think my memoir was personal, and that was a memoir. It's supposed to be personal. So it's a really different, what if this book is more academic. So I think that I made the decision, I guess I broke it to some extent by including the personal voice more than it's usually included in an academic text. But I can't think of any way that one could write purely in personal voice and yet also have some kind of academic weight. So it's a dilemma, I agree with you.
But would you just would you say that you were strategically bringing your own voice in at points where you felt that the objective or historical information was not sufficient, and you would sort of put yourself in and then take yourself out as you went along in the book?
To some extent, but yes, to some extent, but that kind of shifting around is actually very much part of the feminist project. I'm not unique at all in this.
Sure.
Feminists do insist that the personal voice is always in the text,
Yeah,
even if you
yeah.
pretend it isn't.
Right.
So in some places, like claims to objectivity and so on, but in some places it was actually directly pertinent to say I'm rooted in my experience in this particular way. So yes, I do use
Okay.
that
Thank you.
back and forth a bit, yeah.
Yes, please.
American Islam is finally is seen in a transnational sense, and I'm not surprised that Imam Muhammad Majid came across as such as a Sudanese who's married to an African American convert to Islam. What I'm thinking about is American Muslim women is their wearing of the headscarf seen as a political pawn or tool, or not wearing it, just as with Bourguiba, when Bourguiba, before he got elected, was like, yes, wear these headscarves because it is a symbol of freedom and it's anti-French, and then when he becomes the president, he is asking for them to take it off. So are women, American Muslim women specifically, is their headscarf being used, or the conversation about it being used as a tool?
Well, you know, I think one of my main conclusions has been that the veil has kind of broken its moorings from from the old historical patriarchal notions of anybody being used as a tool. It's now women, actually, who define whatever it means. For the majority, at least certainly in America, where they're free, but actually elsewhere too. So I do think whatever its meaning is very often whatever the woman wearing it decides is its meaning. It's not some other person telling her or controlling. I mean, there must be cases of that too. But I do think that the hijab wearing is now, and since around the 70s, actually, with this so-called Islamist revolution, that's when its meaning shifted and is now in the hands of the women. So I don't think on the whole that, I mean, some places, of course, it is used as a tool, but in America, it's very often the women themselves who are defining what it means.
I think we have time for one more question before we move to the informal conversation across the street. Would anyone else? Yes, please.
One question. You touched on Europe briefly in your comments, but I wonder what this means for European Muslim women, in particular, given sort of legislation that's targeted them in various countries, and we discussed choice a little bit, right? So the agency of choice has been removed from them in specific situations. So are there implications that are different than what it is for American Muslim women?
I think certainly the rules making, the kind of laws that France and other places have introduced do make it, give it an edge. I mean, even here, and even in Egypt in the 70s or Middle Eastern societies, it always does have, when you're a minority, some power to convey a message of resistance to the dominant. You know, so it's always has that potential meaning. And I mean, some of the women I quoted that I interviewed said to me, one of them said that she was wearing it to bring attention for the same reason that her Jewish friends wore a yarmulke, to bring attention to the rights of minorities in this country. Another told me she wore it because she wanted to draw attention to gender oppression, the way that sexism of Western, normal American dress. They were calling hijab sexist. Well, she said, I want them to wake up and ask themselves, why am I dressed in the way that I'm dressed? So it always has a potential to challenge the majority. So long as people are a minority, I don't think it has these meanings of challenge now, certainly not in societies where it's required by law, but it has, I mean, even in America, although we have never had, thank goodness, we do not have laws forbidding women to wear hijab. But there were attacks on women. There still are attacks on women who wear hijab. So it's already a statement of something, of saying, I have a right to my beliefs. Whether it's almost implicitly it's there. So it has it all the more so when some government makes a law saying you're not allowed to wear it, yes.
So I'd like to draw our formal session to a close, again, first of all, by inviting you across the street if you're not from this neighborhood. The Center for the Study of World Religions is right across the street. Go back into the common room, this nice reception set up, which also serves the purpose to continue the conversation. So please come if you can. Stay a minute or an hour as you wish. And I'd like to close by thanking Kecia and Susan and Jane for wonderful discussant comments and insights, enriching our conversation, and particularly to Leila for writing the book and for giving us this opportunity to think about it together. But thank you very much.